Hi, thank you for joining me with Reading with Robin. Today I want to read a very special story about Easter in the garden. This is a story about a little boy named Micah, and Micah was friends with Jesus. And when Micah and his dad would work in the garden, a lot of times they would see some things that were very special to them. Well, on this story, Micah actually saw Jesus. So it is a little bit of a lengthy story. I am going to show pictures after I read each page. It's probably one of the best Easter stories I have read in a long, long time. Micah carried a small rake and a stick that was sharpened at one end. He tried to step in the footprints left by his father's sandals in the dusty Jerusalem road as they walked to the garden where his father worked. Micah felt proud that he had his own tools to use as he helped his father dig up weeds or rake the dead leaves from under the olive trees. Sometimes, if there were flowers blooming, Micah picked a small bouquet to take home to his mother. Then she would smile, pat him on the head, and tell him that one day he would grow up to be a wonderful gardener just like his dad. But there was something else Micah liked to do, even more than working in the garden. When the morning sun was just starting to wake up in the world, Micah loved to creep out to the house, and he would go to the garden by himself. In the center of the garden, an old olive tree raised its twisted limbs towards the sky. Micah wedged his toes and fingers into the bumpy bark and clambered up to the trunk to one of the highest branches. There he hid in the soft green leaves, pretending he was a bird or a shiny-eyed lizard waiting for a tasty cricket to hop on by. Sneaking out of the house, and he climbed up in the tree. One morning, as Micah sat daydreaming in the olive tree, he spied a surprise tucked into a forked branch. It was a small, round bird nest. Carefully, he crept along the branch until he could look more closely. And in the nest, Micah found 3 small speckled eggs. He wondered what kind of bird had laid them and when they might hatch. After the morning, each time Micah went to the garden, he scampered up the tree to check on the eggs. But they always looked the same, still and smooth as small speckled stones. One day, after helping his father, Micah stayed behind to peek into the nest one more time. Nothing had changed, Micah sighed. Then he had a scary thought. What if the baby birds weren't going to hatch? What if they had died? Slowly he climbed down the tree trunk and started up the dusty road toward home. Just then, he heard loud voices in the distance. Micah ran to see what was happening. He saw a crowd of angry people yelling and waving their fists in the air. Roman soldiers dressed in bronze helmets, red tunics, waved their iron swords, ordering the crowds to make way. They looked fierce, so Micah ducked behind a stone wall, and he waited for the mob to pass by. His heart was pounding with fear. As soon as they were gone, Micah ran all the way home. "Mother, mother," he shouted as he rushed to the doorway. Micah's mother sat on a low stool with her head in her hands. And when she looked up, Micah could see tears were streaming in her eyes. She held out her arms and Micah ran into them. "What is happening?" Micah asked his mother. She held him tightly and she went to tell him something very, very sad had happened. Their friend Jesus was dead. Bad men had killed him. Micah's eyes filled with tears too. He and his family believed Jesus was God's son. He had come to share God's love with people and to tell them to be kind and forgiving to each other. Once Micah's mother had taken him to see Jesus, and Micah got to sit on Jesus' lap. Jesus had smiled and Micah had felt safe, but he didn't feel safe anymore. He felt afraid. The next day was Saturday, the Sabbath. Micah stayed indoors with his family all day. They talked about God and about Jesus, and they lit the Sabbath candles and had a meal of roasted lamb and bread. No one did work on the Sabbath day. It was a time to rest and be with people that you loved. Micah usually felt happy and safe on the Sabbath, but not today. He thought about the angry people and about never seeing Jesus again. And he also thought about the little bird's eggs that did not hatch. Early the next day, Micah woke up while it was still dark, and he remembered the scary feeling he had when the angry people shouted and the soldiers marched through the streets. Then Micah remembered the nest in the olive tree and the 3 speckled eggs. What had happened to them? Were they still there? Quickly he tossed on his tunic over his head and tied his sandals on his feet, and quietly he tiptoed out of the house. Then he raced to the garden, and he scrambled up the old olive tree. Carefully he crept out onto the branch, and he peeked into the bird's nest. The 3 speckled eggs were as still as stones. Then Micah heard voices. Someone was coming. He ducked behind a branch, and he peeked on through the leaves. He tried to stay as still as the little eggs in the nest. Some women hurried up the path and passed right below Micah. They carried baskets, and they were crying, and they were whispering very quietly. But suddenly a bright light shone in front of the women, and they gasped in fear, and they hid their faces. Micah felt his heart pounding. He didn't know what was happening. The light seemed to fade, and Micah saw a man standing in front of the women. He wore a robe of glistening white, and when he spoke, his voice was clear and strong, but it sounded very kind. The man told the women that Jesus was not dead. He was alive. Then he told the women to hurry and tell Jesus' friends the good news. The women were so excited they dropped their baskets and they grabbed up their robes and they ran from the garden laughing with joy. Micah was so excited that he almost fell out of the tree. And as he grabbed a branch to catch himself, he saw something wiggle inside the bird's nest. One of the speckled eggs was cracked, and when he looked more closely, Micah saw a tiny beak poking out of the shell. The egg was beginning to hatch. "Jesus is alive, little bird," Micah whispered. "You don't have to hide. It's safe to come out of your shell now because Jesus is alive." Micah jumped to the ground. He wasn't afraid anymore. He looked around the garden. The first pink rays of sunlight were shining in the east, and streaks of gold and purple lit up the early morning sky. Dew sparkled on the grasses and the flowers. Then he heard the first tiny chirp of the baby bird. The whole world was waking up to a brand new day. And Micah couldn't wait to tell his family the best news of all. Jesus is alive. Happy Easter, everyone. Jesus is alive.